You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast produced by Veteran Strategies and featuring conversations with fascinating and impactful men and women who have shaped our world, our communities, and our history. My name is Robert Vane, Principal of Veteran Strategies, and your host for our discussion. You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and NFP, a national insurance broker with strong local content. Our podcast is featured on the All Indiana Podcast Network in partnership with Wish TV. You may find Leaders and Legends at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. Thinking of starting a podcast or need to host a public meeting? Let Leaders and Legends LLC be your partner as you look for new ways to communicate your message. Please contact Chris Spangle or me at leadersandlegends.net. And as always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Thank you for joining us on the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest today, New York Times best-selling author, Stephen M. Gillon. We are discussing his new book, Presidents at War: How World War II Shaped a Generation of Presidents, from Eisenhower and JFK through Reagan and Bush. And by Bush, he means George H.W. Bush. As you would expect from a historian who's done such amazing work as Professor Gillon, the book is terrific. It's comprehensive. I fussed at some part of it while reading, but that's to be expected. And Professor Gillon's going to set me straight. Thank you, sir, for coming on the Leaders and Legends podcast.
Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
I shouldn't bury the lead. I'll just tell you that a lot of times I do these history interviews wearing my Richard Nixon's The One shirt, which I spared you today. So, Presidents at War. You've written books on John F. Kennedy, Bill Clinton, Newt Gingrich. How did this book come into your mind? And did you have some sort of specific tasks or goals for the reader when they were done?
So I've always been fascinated by the presidency, and I've always written books that, not all my books, but most of them somehow or another revolve around the presidency. And I just written a small little book about a World War II hero named Len Lamel. And I loved World War II. And, I was talking to my editor. We're trying to figure out ideas of ways to combine the two. And this idea just came up, to write a book, combine the two, write a book about World War II, but how it influenced men who went on to the presidency. And I was surprised to see there have been no other books written about it. I know there's the Best Class book about presidents of war.
That's more commander-in-chief type stuff.
That's right. This book is about the influence that World War II had on these men. And my goal, I consider myself a storyteller. And I wrote this book with the idea of telling a story and showing the legacy of World War II, and how it created a generation of leaders who, despite their individual differences in personality and style, for the most part, all shared the same worldview, especially about America's role in the world. There are varying degrees of that. I mean, a lot of the book focuses on the lessons of Munich, the belief that this generation was determined not to repeat the mistakes that the West made in dealing with Hitler in the 1930s. And they took those lessons and applied them to the post-war world. It worked brilliantly in Western Europe at the end of the war, the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan. But what they learned the hard way, that these lessons they learned from World War II did not apply in other parts of the world, and especially in Vietnam. that's the main idea. Is that the other thing is, like, I have a lot of respect for all of these men. Like, I know that with Richard Nixon, for example, like, very few people know about Richard Nixon's service during World War II. And here's a guy who had a cushy job at the Office of Price Administration. He was exempt from the war because from the draft, because it was considered an essential job. But he volunteers. Not only does he volunteer, but he pushes as hard as he possibly can to get to the front lines. And he gets close, but not quite there. And that's generally true, I found, of this generation, which surprised me. This is the generation that used their privilege to get closer to combat, not to run away from it. I'm sorry.
Well, I'm going to stay with, I've got all kinds of notes here, talk about different parts of your book, but I have a big giant red heart next to Nixon, not just because I love him, and the Leaders and Legends podcast features him quite a bit because of the fascinating nature of who he is as a person and why the hell he ever chose politics. To me, it's like Bobby Knight playing golf. Like, what in the hell are you doing? I can't think of something worse for you based on your personality. But your book spans from Ike, who was elected in 52, through Bush, who was elected in 88, then loses to Clinton in 92. And I have several like themes written down here, or threads. But one of the threads I have is Nixon. Nixon is the only one who you can connect to every single person, every single one of these 7 presidents, the 6 other ones. Talk a little bit just about Nixon so I can move on to other things about how he was Ike's vice president. He was JFK's friend then rival. He was LBJ's, evil twin. He selects Ford to be vice president. He's fearful of Reagan. George Bush held numerous positions that were associated with Nixon. How does, as Bob Dole said at Nixon's funeral, it's the age of Nixon. Is that an overstatement?
No, I don't think it is. And you're right. Nixon is the one person that, threads through all of this. And he is a fascinating, mysterious character. I mean, politics was probably the worst thing for him, but it's what he always wanted to do.
Right.
And all these future presidents, had different motivations for going to war. Patriotism was the primary one. But if you had political ambitions, they all knew that every road to politics ran through World War II. And this is true of everyone except perhaps Eisenhower. And Nixon, I just think Nixon evolves and he changes. Like I had a hard time connecting the Nixon who volunteered for the Navy, who lobbied to get to the front lines in the Pacific, and the Nixon of Watergate. And I think for me, the connection with Nixon is not so much his experience in the war. I think his experience in the war and dealing with people from all different backgrounds provided him with the political skills that he would later use to create his new majority, or the silent majority. He learned to communicate with people who were very different from him. But I think the really formative aspect of World War II in his personality was his work in the Office of Price Administration, where he was exposed to what he believed to be excessive government regulations. He came to resent, Nixon graduated near the top of his class at Duke Law School. He tried to get jobs on Wall Street. He couldn't do it. So he went back to Whittier, and there was a lot of resentment, toward the Eastern establishment. And I think that all is sort of ingrained in him from those years at the Office of Price Administration. Then the war gives him the skills he needs to become a successful politician. And he becomes the, most successful politician. I mean, if you take Watergate out of the picture, he is the most successful politician in the post-war American. But
on five national tickets, he wins. He wins 4.
And then he becomes the wise man. And especially he was prescient when it came to advising Bush about what would happen in the Soviet Union if he did not provide Yeltsin with enough aid. And Nixon, I think, always understood that there was this strong authoritarian streak in Russia that could easily come back if democracy doesn't take root. But no one really listened to him. My favorite story about Nixon, and this also relates to another book that I wrote. I wrote a book about my friend John Kennedy Jr. And Nixon, at one point, invited John, his mom, and Caroline to the White House. No press, no reporters. It was a very private thing. And John spilled
what was the highlight? That's right.
Yeah, John spilled milk on him. And he just took it in stride. So he was capable of these acts of generosity. I think of all the presidents that I covered, he's the most complicated.
And remains so.
Yeah. I think that one of the mistakes that historians make when they write history is they write it backwards, right? So for Nixon, it's Watergate. So all the biographies of Nixon start with Watergate and think, okay, was this personality created? Where did he go wrong? And then, and that distorts things because you start out with a sort of a narrow thesis about how things are going to be. But if you allow Nixon, look at him in the whole, in totality, he's more than just Watergate. And I think that was, he's very shrewd and sophisticated in his dealings with the Soviet Union and his détente really was the beginning of the end of the Cold War. But he and his Secretary of State Kissinger, National Security Advisor and Secretary of State Kissinger, just were so obsessed with American credibility in Vietnam that they could not bring themselves to recognize that we were not winning the war. And I think Gerald Ford kind of inherits that same mindset. And I think that was one of his major failings.
It was interesting. You remember a book called The People's Almanac? It came out in the 70s. It was Wallace. The Wallace family put it together. And they had a poll. They discussed a poll. So I was reading this in the mid to late 70s. So it's right after Watergate. And the poll was like, worst president, least trustworthy president, all these sorts of things, right? And Nixon finishes last. President with the best foreign policy. Nixon was first. So no one trusted him. They hated him after Watergate, but they still gave him his props about foreign policy. And I was probably 7 or 8 when I read it, and I never forgotten that, because it just shows that people can have divergent opinions and say X, Y, and Z about you is terrible. But in Nixon's case, I want to ask you about the other presidents. Mm-hmm. Ike, you start your book. He's the first president you detail. 5-star general. Leadership credentials off the charts. Nobody knew if he was an R or a D for a long time. I don't get this.
Didn't know.
I was just getting right sense. I know, like Marshall, George General of the Army Marshall, said he didn't vote because he didn't want to vote for or against his commander in chief. But of all the people who on your list, it seems to me that Ike is the most. Well, of course he's going to be president. He was a 5-star general. What's next? But Ike turned out, is it fair to say, perhaps a little different than maybe the folks who backed him originally thought he would be?
The thing about Eisenhower is that he was very restrained in the use of force. Now, you think you have a 5-star general as president, that they're going to be, wanting to get involved in lots of different conflicts. And Eisenhower, and this is true of, the presidents who saw combat up close. And Eisenhower is certainly one of them, but the other two are Kennedy and Bush. I found that they deliberated harder about whether or not to use force than most of the other presidents. And for Eisenhower, there's this great moment where, when the Dien Bien Phu, the French base in Vietnam, is surrounded and about to be forced to surrender. And there's a meeting of the National Security Council, and everyone's telling Eisenhower, we have to get involved. And Nixon even recommends using the bomb. And Eisenhower, he was strong enough, he understood the military enough that he was able to face down all of his advisors. He said, no, we cannot get involved in a war in Asia. It's just not going to happen. And he was the only president who had the stature to say that. Now, what's interesting about Eisenhower is that meeting was in the morning, and then later that afternoon, he held a press conference where he announced the domino theory, which was the exact opposite of what he had just said in private. And the domino theory, this idea that, one country falls in Asia, the next thing you know, we'll have communists coming ashore in Los Angeles, became a concept that became something of a prison for a lot of the presidents that followed. And this is true of Kennedy too, where I think their rhetoric, they were far more sophisticated in their understanding of America's role in the world than their rhetoric would suggest. And behind the scenes, Eisenhower was as confident in his ability and knowledge that he was willing to face down his entire national security staff just about and refused to go into Vietnam. But then rhetorically provided justification for future presidents to go into Vietnam.
Is it accurate to say, in your opinion, that of these 7 presidents, nobody came into the Oval Office with more credibility than Eisenhower?
Oh, of course. Yeah. I mean, no one had the stature of Dwight Eisenhower. He was an international hero. I mean, and a great American hero. Truman, when Eisenhower went to Europe, and Truman was when Truman went to Europe and met with Eisenhower, he told him that he would support him if he ran in 1948. Truman's already president. So he had universal appeal, and everyone leading up to 52, like you said, no one knew what he was going to do, whether he was going to run for president or not, or if he did, what party. And Democrats are hoping to run as a Democrat. But, for Eisenhower, the main reason why he became a Republican was because of Robert Taft. And he feared that the isolationists would take control of the Republican Party. And he thought it was his patriotic duty to run and win the Republican nomination, if for no other reason than to put the isolationists in their place. So it wasn't that he had strong principles that went clearly along Democratic or Republican lines, although he was a fiscal conservative. His view of the world was far more sophisticated than most people give him credit for. And that's why, Will Hitchcock, I think, has written the best biography of Eisenhower, because he brings all this out. And you see that how Eisenhower, the Kennedys, when they ran in 1960, really did a disservice to Eisenhower and his presidency. And many liberal historians who write about modern America have been largely dismissive of him as someone who has liked to play golf. He was much more than that.
And his presidential ranking is going up about the same rate that Woodrow Wilson's is going down. He certainly has. Sorry about that. I just did a podcast with the former California Congressman Christopher Cox, wrote a biography of Wilson. It's terrific. You mentioned, I asked that question about credibility to lead into this next question. I don't know that you could have gone from one extreme to the other better than Eisenhower to JFK. Age, maybe outlook. You mentioned the Kennedys. They thought that Eisenhower was just kind of an old dope, just playing golf, all the time. But JFK runs in 60. he and Richard Daley win the presidency. Sorry, that's my pro Nixon jab for the show. Anyway, and you'd think this young kid, right? But JFK's resume for president is terrific. Whatever you think of him, I mean, he's a bona fide, genuine war hero. He should have received the Navy Cross for what he did after the PT-109 was sunk. What are your impressions of JFK, World War II, and his presidency?
JFK, like Bush, I think were the two who came closest to losing their lives during the war. And I think that instilled in them a reluctance to use force. So Kennedy campaigns against Nixon, really campaigning against Eisenhower, talking about a missile gap. Well, there was no missile gap. Eisenhower knew it, but
and Eisenhower knew it, you said, yeah. And Nixon knew it.
Yeah, but Kennedy, but Kennedy just kept beating him over the head. And what was fascinating is, they had two meetings after the election. Kennedy goes to the White House twice to meet with Eisenhower, and both times he comes out incredibly impressed by Eisenhower, not just his stature, but his understanding of the world. And then Kennedy comes in with this, again, his rhetoric. Kennedy was so articulate that he took this concept of the domino theory and the whole lessons of Munich and just elevated to a different level of fear, and used it to justify his spending a lot more in the military, which is exactly what Eisenhower's farewell address was really a warning about Kennedy, because he feared that the military industrial complex that Kennedy was so much promoting would, if it had too much power, would actually damage America's reputation. So Kennedy comes in. He has this, I think, despite his strident anti-communist rhetoric, comes in with a fairly sophisticated view of the world, and a recognition of the limitations of American power. But the first thing he does, he gets sucked into the Bay of Pigs. This was a plan that was originally created under Eisenhower. When Kennedy comes in, he thinks there's too much of a footprint for the United States. So he gradually takes away a lot of the U.S. elements that were part of the invasion. And many of the generals who were seeing this believed that it probably wouldn't work now. But they just assumed that if it wasn't working and these rebels were being slaughtered on the beaches of the Bay of Pigs, that Kennedy would have no choice but to use air power to save them. And they were wrong. Kennedy did not. And then when you look at the way he dealt with, I think that was a searing experience for him, and made him he and Johnson came out of the military with the most distrust of the military leadership. And Kennedy acted on it when he was in the White House. Johnson did not, because he didn't trust his own instincts. So you see Kennedy, and the thing about Kennedy is he grows in office, both in domestic affairs and in foreign policy. He is really the originator of détente with his American University speech. He recognizes that a war, no one would win a nuclear war, and this comes out in the debates over the Cuban Missile Crisis. So I think it's one of the greatest examples of crisis management that we have in the White House. And Kennedy has given these choices of doing nothing, bombing, sending in troops afterwards, or establishing a quarantine. And he takes he takes the option that gives him the most time, which was really a smart thing to do to allow things to diffuse. Of course, we learned years later when an American delegation went to Cuba to meet with all the players in the Cuban Missile Crisis came together. McNamara for the U.S., representatives from the Soviet Union and Cuba. And we found out some 20 years later that the Cubans had tactical nuclear weapons on the island. And if we had launched an invasion, they would have used them against American troops. So Kennedy's decision at the time was wise. It's even wiser in hindsight. So by the time Kennedy is assassinated in 1963, I think he's a very different politician and a very different strategist than he was when he first came to office. And that's why we're left with this question, what if? What if he had lived?
And it seems that we, just like we remember athletes, who make the game-winning shot or the Super Bowl saving tackle or whatever metaphor or comparison you want to use. It seems that so much of Kennedy's legacy is that he got the big things right.
Yeah. Eventually, he got the big things right.
There's a terrific book. I don't know if you're familiar with it. Mark Silverstone.
Of course.
Yeah, the Kennedy.
Mark blurred my book.
Oh, okay. The Kennedy.
I'm a fellow at the Miller Center.
He wrote a book called The Kennedy Withdrawal, Camelot and the American Commitment to Vietnam. He came on the podcast, Leaders and Legends podcast, to discuss that. I didn't know anything about it. I mean, I know a little, but compared to his writing, it was terrific. And it's interesting because Vietnam, domino theory, trusting the military, these are all in my notes. I get the sense that trying to predict what Kennedy would have done in Vietnam is still a little bit of a guess.
Absolutely. Can I tell you a funny story?
Please.
So I was friends with John Jr., right? And we used to get together and have dinner and we talk about politics, about history, and about his father. We had to get into a good discussion about Vietnam and what his father would have done. And my point was that even though many of these people in the administration were saying, he would have pulled out, my point was that, but in 1963 or 1964, politically, that would have been suicide. Because the Vietnam War was incredibly popular. And Democrats would have been wiped out if he had done that. So John nodded, and the next afternoon, he calls me. He used to call me Stevie. He goes, "Stevie, I just talked to Bob McNamara, and he says you're dead wrong." How do you argue with that? But I think I don't know. I think Kennedy did not want to get involved in the ground war in Vietnam. Johnson didn't want to get in the ground war in Vietnam. But the pressures, the political pressures, would have been so great that I think Kennedy probably would have found a way to, I don't think Kennedy would have sent ground troops to Vietnam in the way that Lyndon Johnson did. I think he would have found some way to maneuver around that. But what that is, we'll never know.
Especially if Kennedy thinks he's going up against someone like Barry Goldwater in '64, right, who said on multiple occasions, I remember watching him on the CNN show Crossfire, and Pat Buchanan asked him, "What would you have done in Vietnam if you'd been elected president?" I don't know if this is ringing a bell with you, Steve, but he says, Goldwater's response was, quote, "I would have made a marsh out of North Vietnam." So there's no way you're gonna be a dove on Vietnam heading into '64 with Goldwater, who I think wasn't Goldwater a bomber pilot? Or
I'm not sure. I think he was. I think he served in World War II. Yeah.
Yeah, because George McGovern was a bomber pilot.
That's right.
That's one of the reasons they were such good friends. When it goes back to JFK, I want to also ask you about one of the other themes of your book, because it seems that JFK had the best perspective on it. Munich.
Yeah.
So the Munich Pact is infamous for England and France, and I'm giving the Cliff Notes here. England and France basically handing over a part of Europe to Hitler. Pieces at hand, Neville Chamberlain's on the tarmac, and he's waving the piece of paper. Munich became its own, used the word earlier, and I put it in here, prison. What was John F. Kennedy's perspective on Munich, and how much of his policies as president were born out of his book, Why England Slept?
I don't think you can understand JFK without understanding his views of World War II. His father had been ambassador to England. He was in Parliament when Winston Churchill took over and gave his, one of his famous speeches. He was in Germany. He saw Nazi troops marching through the streets. So he had a real understanding of what took place. And he, like all the other presidents, were committed not to make that same mistake. Now, Kennedy, rhetorically, no one articulated, the lessons of Munich better, more clearly, more forcefully than JFK. But I think what you see in his 3 years in office, not even 3 years, 1,000 days in office, is him beginning to question Munich and wondering whether we overlearned the lessons. And I think he was especially skeptical about whether the lessons of Munich applied to other parts of the world, and especially Asia, which was completely different. Which is why Kennedy doesn't get to agonize over Vietnam because he dies. It's assassinated before it really becomes a crisis. But you see everything he's doing, he's just trying to prop up a regime without getting the United States involved in a wider war. So I think Kennedy is, over the course of his presidency, downplaying, rethinking Munich and the lessons of Munich, especially now that there were two superpowers, and he's trying to find ways to navigate around the possibility of conflict. So that's part of Kennedy's learning curve, which makes him so fascinating and so difficult to get a grip on. You read Kennedy's speeches and you think he is the most ardent Cold War. You listen to his inaugural address, right?
Right, exactly.
But then when you listen to him, like you listen to the debates over the Cuban Missile Crisis, where he's debating Ernest LeMay, the Air Force general who was wanted to just bomb Cuba. But he realizes the risks. And he could play three-dimensional chess. So Kennedy understood that if he does something in Cuba, then Khrushchev can go into Berlin. So he's much more sophisticated thinker, I think, than any of the other presidents who grew out of World War II.
One of my favorite Cold War quotes is from Mr. Nikita Khrushchev, who's called Berlin the testicles of the West.
Yes.
All I have to do is squeeze and make them howl.
Yeah. And Kennedy knew that.
And this is the time of the Berlin Wall. And so, all these things are all going on. It really was kind of the epicenter of the Cold War at the time. You are listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest today is Stephen Gillon. He is Professor Emeritus at the University of Oklahoma and a Senior Fellow at the Miller Center for the Study of the Presidency at the University of Virginia. He's discussing his new book with us. It's called Presidents at War: How World War II Shaped a Generation of Presidents from Eisenhower and JFK through Reagan and Bush. He has dropped the little nugget that he was a close friend of John F. Kennedy Jr. So I'm guessing we need to get a cover of you on the cover of George. If you have one of those pictures, I'll take it. I'll put it up on social media for you, Professor. When I broadcast this to the masses, LBJ. I'm pausing because I don't want to try to state the obvious, but I think the obvious matters here. LBJ got into the war at Vietnam. It's a tragedy that you watch. It's almost like Kennedy's limo turning down, to go Dealey Plaza. You wanted to go, just stop. Don't go any farther. Don't go any further. Excuse me. Don't go any further. How did LBJ put aside his personal distrust of generals in the military to make what seems to be bad decision after tragic decision year after year from 65-ish on until the end of his presidency?
I think, again, you have to go back to his experience during World War II because it reveals a lot about Lyndon Johnson and his character. Most of these men who went off to fight, the only one who didn't go to fight was Reagan, but he's an interesting character too. But they went there because they were driven by a sense of patriotism. Johnson went to war for a photo op. He was already a congressman. And he had run for a Senate seat, which he lost a few years earlier. And he was going around the state and saying, if I ever vote to send your boys to go off to war, I will be in the trenches right next to them. Okay, so Pearl Harbor happened. Johnson goes to Roosevelt, who he was friends with, and who was already in the Navy. And he said, you need to give me something. But he doesn't want to go to battle. He wants some type of a job in Washington. Roosevelt eventually sends him to the West Coast to investigate supply lines. And what's happening is articles are appearing in the local paper in Austin saying, "Where's Lyndon? Everyone's off the war. Where's Lyndon?" So Lyndon comes back to Roosevelt. He begs him, "So let me go on some missions so I can get close to combat." So he goes to the Pacific, and he goes on a bombing raid as an observer. And we talk about how history can hinge on little things. He gets on a plane, and before they take off, he has to use the bathroom. So he gets off, he uses the bathroom. When he gets back onto the plane, someone's in his seat. So he gets on another plane. Well, during that bombing run, the plane that he was originally on gets shot down. So Johnson's with this group. They develop engine problems before they ever get close to the bombing site. But a Japanese Zero finds them and starts shooting at them, and then eventually breaks off to go after the main force. So they land back back safely, and Johnson gets a meeting with MacArthur. And we don't really know exactly what happened, but it seems pretty certain that MacArthur awarded Johnson a Silver Star. The pilot of the plane didn't get a Silver Star. The guy who had manning the guns didn't get a Silver Star. Lyndon Johnson, who just watched, got a Silver Star. And I think the only way to explain that is that he made a deal with MacArthur that he would be his friend in Washington, because MacArthur knew he was close to Roosevelt. So when Johnson leaves the military, he just has contempt for the military leadership. He thinks they're incompetent. He goes on the floor of the House and gives a speech saying that. But then when he becomes president, he has no confidence in his own, unlike Eisenhower, who led troops, or Kennedy, or Nixon, or Bush, who actually saw combat. He doesn't have a real sense of what war is all about. And he defers to these generals, the generals for whom he had contempt just 20 years earlier. And he was overwhelmed by the Kennedy people, who he detested, but who he admired for their intelligence. And he just gets further and further into the sinkhole. And he knows he's getting into a sinkhole, but he can't get out of it. And he makes, and the problem, we have Eisenhower by this point is a hawk. So Eisenhower does not want to commit troops to Vietnam when it's a separate country. But once the United States throws in support to Vietnam, he believes that we have to go all in, we have to win. So Johnson's constantly calling on Eisenhower, getting advice from Eisenhower, asking for advice, making sure Eisenhower wants to keep him close to his side. So he's getting all this pushback from the right, from future presidents like Nixon. No matter what Johnson did, Nixon always attacked him from the right, as did Gerald Ford. So he's kind of trapped. He knows he can't win, doesn't have a strategy for winning, but he's afraid to lose. And it just destroyed his presidency.
Was it Johnson? I had a note here, and now I'm fudging on myself a little bit. Was it Johnson or Kennedy who invited Douglas MacArthur to the White House to discuss kind of what was going on in the Vietnam and Southeast Asia? And they basically said, you don't want up any part of any war in Asia.
Kennedy sought out MacArthur's advice, and that's the advice MacArthur gave him. To stay out of Vietnam, it's not a war that you can win. And Kennedy had contempt for MacArthur, but he appreciated his military smarts. And that was another thing that was weighing on him. I think it was he didn't meet I don't think MacArthur came to the White House. I think it was through an intermediary, being RFK, that MacArthur delivered that message, and Kennedy took it to heart.
We talked a little bit about Nixon, of course, so I want to move on for just a second. But let's talk about the 1968 election. Was Vietnam basically the alpha and omega of that election? And how did Nixon has been accused of, and you detail it in your book, a rather nefarious relationship with a woman named Anna Chennault that involved Vietnam. They were 1968 election. I don't know how many books you read about it, but however many books any of us have read about it, it ain't enough. I like Jules Wickover's book. I thought it was terrific. Anyway, has there been more skullduggery, more sort of backstage drama in an election year than 1968?
No. And, the thing is, you mentioned Vietnam is the vortex around which all of the resentments that had grown up in the 1960s swirled around. So there are lots of issues with race, urban unrest, which certainly played a part, and certainly in Nixon's message of law and order. But it all comes down to Vietnam. And, with Nixon, where he was so brilliant, there were two peace movements in America. There was the organized peace movement, which you saw on college campuses and people protesting, burning draft cards. And then there was the anti-war sentiment. And what is fascinating is that by 1968, a majority of Americans are against the Vietnam War. But sort of this nascent anti-war feeling among the general public, Nixon makes them hate the anti-war protesters more than they hate the war. Even though they hate the same thing, he turned the public against, that's his silent majority, he turned them against the anti-war movement, which allowed him to continue the war. So 68, so Nixon, Johnson, Humphrey's running, he's running behind because he can't break with Johnson because Johnson won't let him. And finally in Salt Lake City in September, he gives a speech where he calls for a bombing halt, which sets Johnson on fire. But
Nixon calls him. Nixon calls him, and Nixon calls Johnson and says, "Hey, I'm not going that way. I'm going to support the administration."
Yeah. So with all this, so you have all these things going on. First of all, Johnson is kissing up to Nixon, right? Because Johnson assumes Nixon is going to win, and Nixon's assuring him that he will continue his policy. So in some ways, Johnson trusts Nixon more than he trusts his own vice president to continue his policy. And Nixon says to him, "I will never dishonor you. I will never disgrace you." Johnson's not so sure that Humphrey will do the same thing, but Johnson enters into peace negotiations, which freaks Nixon out, because if there's a peace treaty 2 weeks before the election, he loses the election because Humphrey's gaining ground as you get closer and closer to election day. So what does Nixon do? He sends a message to South Vietnam saying, don't accept any terms that Johnson gives you because you'll get a better deal from me on the left. So the South Vietnamese government withdraws from the peace talks. Now, Johnson knows all this. And how does he know it? Because he's illegally wiretapping Nixon's phone. So he knows all this stuff that Nixon is doing. So the debate in the White House is, what do you do with this information? And Johnson said it was so close to the election, he wasn't going to do anything. So he punted it to Humphrey. And Humphrey decided not to do it. Some say he did it on principle. He also could have done it because he felt that the public would turn against him, thinking that he's the one who's launching this thing. So there is a file. If you ever are in Austin, have a chance to go to the Johnson Library, which is one of the great presidential libraries, there's a whole file where they've connected all the national security cables, everything. And it's one file you can go to and read through all this stuff. And it's just kind of fascinating.
Well, I watched one of the authors, people we've had on the Leaders and Legends podcast, is Nixon's former aide, Dwight Chapin.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Well, he was central to all this.
Exactly. And, he was as you would expect, pretty pro Nixon on it. I mean, and a lot of when I've read about this or watched TV shows about it, the argument basically is, look, the South Vietnamese didn't need to be told by Anna Chennault that they get a better deal from Nixon. They knew that. Everybody knew that Nixon was going to be tough on the war. Is that an exculpatory point, or is there just too much physical evidence about what was happening? And quite frankly, if you were a one-man judge and jury, was Richard Nixon guilty of treason?
Yes. It's not for a straightforward answer. Whether South Vietnam would have withdrawn from the treaty or not is kind of irrelevant. The fact is that a candidate for president was openly trying to undermine the policy of the United States. And I think that's treason.
In the same documentary I watched, the interviewer spoke with Walter Mondale, who's a senator from Minnesota, certainly part of Hubert Humphrey's political family. And the interviewer asked Vice President Mondale, do you think Lyndon Johnson voted for Hubert Humphrey?
No.
And the pause is long, and he goes, I don't know.
So I wrote Mondale's biography many years ago.
I'd have loved to have had him on the podcast. I'm not someone I would have voted for probably, but he certainly was involved in so many cool things.
That's right. Yeah, I don't think Johnson, we don't know, but I think he voted for Nixon because I think, there was this love affair going on between Johnson and Nixon in the final months of that 68 campaign after Johnson withdraws. And I think it comes down to is that Johnson did not trust, he thought Humphrey was weak. In many ways he was. And I think he believed that Nixon was more likely to preserve his policy in Vietnam than Hubert Humphrey was. So I would not be the least bit surprised if he voted for Nixon.
You're listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest today is Professor Stephen Gillon. We're discussing his book, Presidents at War, How World War II Shaped a Generation of Presidents from Eisenhower and JFK through Reagan and Bush. And that's Bush 41. I really enjoyed the book Rumsfeld wrote several years ago about the Ford presidency.
Mm-hmm.
I remember the Nixon resignation speech, so I was old enough for that. And that's August 9th I think the speech is the 8th. And he resigns on the 9th, August 9th of 74. So I remember President Ford, the assassination attempts, all that. Seems like a good and decent man. I was surprised reading your book. I wasn't surprised. I was ignorant. I didn't know how hawkish he was on Vietnam. And it seems of all the people who could be selected to preside over the fall of South Vietnam, the fact that it's Gerald Ford to me seems interesting. How did he manage the end of that war? And how did his World War II experiences inform his decisions? Because we also know at a certain point, he didn't have any decisions to make.
That's right. No, Ford, it's unfortunate. Ford really was an incredibly decent person. And that's even people who were Democrats or people who ran against them will always tell you that he was a really decent human being. But he just inherited so much crap left over from Nixon. Pardon my French.
We allow it.
All right, good. On the domestic side, Nixon had imposed these wage and price controls, which were a complete disaster. So you have stagflation that Ford is trying to deal with in a traditionally conservative way by not using government force or government policies. And in the war, the thing about Ford is by the time he comes to office, we've lost the war. And Ford, I don't know whether Ford really believed it or not, but he continued after he left office, saying that we could have won the war, that there was still an opportunity, if we dropped a few more bombs. And I don't know whether that was a strategy so they could blame Congress for withdrawing funds, or whether he was so imbued by the lessons of Munich that he continued to believe that right up until the very end. And I don't know. He never expressed, while he was president or in his long life after being president, any sense that he believed that we were bound to lose the war. He said that we would have won the war if we had just continued his policies. And it's just, at that point, it's absurd. So whether he believed that or whether he just wanted to blame Congress for cutting off funds, I don't know. But Ford was
Congress was controlled by the Democrats in 1975. Right. Ford's a Republican, so politically.
Yeah. And the one thing that surprised me was Ford was a hardcore hawk all the way through the Vietnam War. It's not until 1968 that Republicans start toning down their rhetoric and stop talking about winning the war and start talking about peace. And almost in unison, they changed their language in accordance with what Nixon was trying to do in the campaign. But he, going back to the lessons of Munich, he constantly refers to Munich and the need to fight communism, and how what a blow it would be to the United States to lose in Vietnam. And he believes it right up to the bitter end.
Why do you think 68, or why do you know 1968 was a watershed in the rhetoric of Republicans and hawks about Vietnam?
Because in 68 was the first time a majority of Americans opposed the war. And Republicans, they didn't want to hear about winning the war. They wanted to know about how we're going to get out. They were more interested in a peace settlement than they were in a military victory. And Nixon and his pollsters, I'm sure, picked up on that. So what was his phrase that he used in the 68 campaign? Peace with honor. And that became the new rhetoric. You don't hear Nixon or Ford talking about peace while Johnson's escalating the war. They were talking about winning the war and winning the war. Nixon pivots in 68, makes himself the peace candidate. Not that I'm going to win the war candidate, but the peace candidate.
Right.
And the whole Republican establishment just moves in behind him on that.
Is there a point, going back to Johnson real quick, where things could have been different? Is there an inflection point where if he zigged instead of zagging, things would have turned, we would have rewritten the last quarter century or last 35 years of American history in the 20th century? In other words, was it the Maddox and Turner Joy? What was it in your mind when President Johnson did X? This is the fateful step that put us on the road to Vietnam as we know it.
It's a great question. I think it's got to be the commitment of ground troops in July of 1965, where he Americanized the war. There was no turning back at that point, because once American troops are on the ground, American troops are dying, it's hard to say, okay, we were wrong. We can't win this war. So I think that is really the decisive turning point. And if he had only listened to George Ball, who was the single dissenting voice, who turned out to be prophetic about what would happen in Vietnam. If he had just listened to Ball and not committed those ground troops, that would have been a turning point. But having said that, he would have destroyed his presidency. There have been this is the problem with Vietnam, is people forget it was a popular war. It was a popular war really up until you see polls moving against it in 67. I think 68 is the first time the majority of Americans are opposed to the war. You look at polls in 63, 64, even 65, vast majority of Americans believe that we should go into Vietnam and we should win the war. So I just think it's unrealistic.
Forgive me, to the theme of your book, right? So if your proximate foundation of the beneficial force or beneficial use of American force is World War II, even Korea, we saved the South Koreans. Why wouldn't you be in favor of the war? Like when the American military gets involved, good things happen, whether for the South Koreans or for the Europeans or for the Filipinos or, we kick the Kaiser out. I mean, the list goes on, right? So the entire American psyche and history of military involvement has been positive. So why wouldn't you be positive about the war?
Oh, I agree with you 100%. And that's something I think a lot of people a lot of people forget. It's easy to say if Johnson did not send ground troops, but Vietnam was on the verge of collapse. So he remembered. Both Kennedy and Johnson remembered when Truman lost China and the blowback that resulted from that and the rise of Joe McCarthy. So there was a real heavy political price to be paid for not escalating the war. So that's why I am, more forgiving of the presidents, Kennedy, who sent advisors, Johnson, who vastly escalated the war, and Nixon, who changed the strategy but not the goal, because the environment in which we live in a democracy, right? And politicians have to be aware of public opinion. And if Johnson had lost Vietnam in 1965, he would have been impeached. His party would have been wiped out even more than it was in the 1966 elections.
66, yeah.
Yeah, so I have that sympathy. Like, as an historian, I don't think it's my right, knowing what I know now, to go back and judge people based on the decisions they made. You have to understand what they had in front of them, what information they had in front of them, and understand the consequences of that. But I don't think, I think historians sometimes are overly judgmental.
I was told in graduate school not to be teleological.
Teleological.
At what point in American history did the Vietnam syndrome replace the Munich syndrome as a driver of presidential actions?
So I think what happens here, World War II is this uniting event that brings all Americans together and teaches that generation very clear-cut lessons that were later misapplied. Vietnam does no such thing. Vietnam, there's a whole group of people who came out of Vietnam believing that we could have won the war if we had fought it differently. And
wait a second. I meant to ask forgive me for being rude. Do you believe that?
No, I don't.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, no, I think if you look at the way we fought the war, I just don't think a few more bombs would have made a difference. Certainly by 1972, 1973. But people came, unlike World War II, that produced a singular lesson. Vietnam produced lots of different lessons, and people fall into different categories after Vietnam, which is why it's one of the reasons why we're so polarized today, because there was no single lesson that grew out of Vietnam. For those on the left, mainly embraced the lesson that we needed to limit, that American power was limited, that we needed to be more careful in the way we used force, and that we had to make better use of soft power. But then on the right, the right came away with very strong opinions as well, which is that we simply fought the war the wrong way, and we lost it because of the student protesters and cowardly elected officials who gave in to this political pressure. So I think we've been living in an age since then where there's no clear consensus about what America's role in the world is and how we exercise power.
And you mentioned in your litany of the reasons why conservatives think the war was lost. In the book, you mentioned the liberal media. I mean, people who are Republicans, we tend to not put the news media up on our trophy stand, but at the time, minus sort of Cronkite's "the war's lost, an honorable peace" sort of thing. The media coverage of Vietnam, to me, is one of the greatest examples of the First Amendment. What they were allowed to show on television, simply astonishing. If people haven't taken time to watch it, I mean, you watched Morley Safer and Dan Rather and the list. I mean, they're getting shot at right there. What was the media's role in helping either to create the Vietnam syndrome or maybe dispel it?
In most part, there was a great book written years ago by a guy named Daniel Howland, where he sat down and went through all the media coverage, both on television and the major newspapers like the New York Times and David Halberstam. And what he found is that the media kind of tracked public opinion, that he didn't see the media changing views as much as he did see them reinforcing public opinion. So early on, David Halberstam became an anti-war hero. When you read his articles in the New York Times in 61, 62, he's clearly in favor of America's involvement in Vietnam. But the media, like the public, soured over time. And it's really not until 68 that you see a break where the media, overall, the mainstream media moves against the war. And that's something that Nixon, of course, infuriated Nixon, and the way they covered him and his policy toward the Vietnam War. But I don't see the media as the villain or even a major source for us losing the war. And I think most of the studies tend to confirm that early on the media was as pro-war as anybody else. As the war ground on, you see more skeptical reports. I mean, the access that they had also allowed Morley Safer covering American soldiers burning down, huts. So the images that came back spoke for themselves sometimes, and sometimes undermining the message that the government was trying to present.
Did you read the book Haunting Legacy?
No.
You're should
giving
read
me all these books to read.
You're the professor. I'm just the student. Haunting Legacy. I read it about 10 years ago or so. It's by Marvin Kalb.
Oh yeah, sure. He's great.
And it's called Haunting Legacy: Vietnam and the American Presidency from Ford to Obama.
I've read it.
It's a terrific book.
It's actually, you don't have to buy the book. It's online, and you can read the whole book online. I read it online.
It's terrific.
It's a great book. Yeah,
yes.
He's really smart, very sophisticated. And I may even have quoted him. I think I referenced him at certain points in my book.
We have 2 presidents left to go, so I want to be judicious with your time because we still have to get to the 5 questions we ask everybody, all of our guests. I'm going to say, I'm going to be a bit of a political hack for just a second, and then you can push back on me. Please do. Your treatment of Ronald Reagan in your book is a little rough for me, but again, please take it with a grain of political hackery salt. Lou Cannon is someone who I think that has worked pretty hard to let's say maybe polish up Reagan's legacy as a World War II non-combatant. I think that's a nice way to put it. But yet, so much of World War II leads to the Cold War, and it's Reagan who should get as much credit as anyone in the United States for ending the Cold War, in my view. How did World War II, Reagan's non-participation in combat, sort of lead to his what you articulate as his absolute disdain for the existence of nuclear weapons?
Actually, the thing that surprised me the most, because I did not have a high opinion of Reagan. And I originally assumed that since he did not go overseas and didn't fight, that he had this very superficial understanding of what war was, which is why he's so bellicose. But what I realized is that he he came away from the war with a fear of nuclear weapons. He actually joined a liberal organization for the control of atomic weapons. Now, he shed most of his liberal affiliations, but not that one. And I think that, it makes him the perfect person to be president when Gorbachev comes to power, because Reagan's advisors, with the exception of the Secretary of State, George Shultz, all told him not to trust Gorbachev. And they felt it was a trap. And Reagan followed his own instincts. And his instinct was that, we need to do something to lower the threat of nuclear weapons. And over the advice and the objections, sometimes heated objections of many of the advisors, he was the one who reached out to Gorbachev. So I agree with you. If anyone in the United States, Reagan deserves credit for being receptive to Gorbachev's overtures. I think Gorbachev deserves most of the credit for the end of the Cold War. But Reagan was certainly the key person to be there at that moment to help make it happen.
We've had on the podcast, Ambassador Ken Edelman has come on to discuss his book, Reagan at Reykjavik. If you've not read that, it's fabulous. Actually, there's a new version that's going to be out soon. Mm-hmm. Ambassador Edelman was terrific, and I loved that book. But Ford did not. You mentioned JFK and Nixon, Bush. We'll get to him in just a second. Actively sought combat. I got to go to the front lines. Reagan did not. Reagan's service was completely different. And yet, he didn't seem to politically take a hit for it. Is that a fair or unfair statement?
Well, you can thank the gossip magazines for that. Reagan, the studio was so concerned that Reagan would lose his status as a star if the public knew that he was, working at a studio not far from his home in LA. So they created all these scenes, where Reagan would show up at a movie premiere in his uniform, and the magazines would show him kissing his wife, Jane Weinman at the time, goodbye and going off to battle. So they really created this whole myth about Reagan being in combat. And Reagan himself kind of has fudged it over the years. So the reason why he didn't face any blowback was because the studios went out of their way, were very aggressive in painting a portrait of a man who was in combat.
So if I was a historian and I came to you and I'm writing a book and the entire thesis of the book is that Ronald Reagan was a draft dodger during World War II, what would your reaction to me be?
I would say no, he wasn't a draft dodger. I think he served in a role that was created for him to allow him to stay home, to build public support for the war. So that's not being a draft dodger.
And he tried to enlist, or he tried to. Is that fair to say that he took some steps to try to, because that's what everybody was doing. And he's got his buddies, Clark Gable and Jimmy Stewart and all these other folks serving. So there had to be some pressure, even if he wasn't necessarily looking forward to serving in the military or in combat.
Well, the studios did everything they could to keep him stateside. They lobbied aggressively so that he would be able to stay in California and make movies. And they sold it to the draft board by saying that this will be his service, that he'll make movies. And he did. At the end, he was narrating films that were used by American pilots on their bombing raids on Tokyo. So, he played a small part in the war. I think what has been neglected is the role the powerful studios played in both manufacturing this myth that he was fighting, but also in making sure he never left the United States. But he's by no means a draft dodger.
We mentioned the liberal media, the quote unquote liberal media a few minutes ago. I remember the Newsweek cover in the late 80s as George H.W. Bush is going to run for president in 1988. And the cover of Newsweek had the language, with a picture of George H.W. Bush. And the caption was the wimp factor.
Yeah.
So if you kind of want to know why Republicans can't stand publications like Newsweek, it's George
Well, a couple of things
H.W.
about that.
Bush.
First of all, that's the plague that every vice president faces, is as vice president, they have to serve their president. And in doing so, they lose their identity. So when they eventually run for president, there's always all these stories. Mondale faced it in '84. Well, you know, who are you?
Ms. Harris faced it when she was asked, you know, would you do something different? Yeah.
More recent example.
It's tough to say.
That thread is true, that carries through for all vice presidents who go on to run for president. And I think the problem with Bush, and I was sort of surprised when I found this, Bush really was a guy who throughout his career had gone along with the flow in the Republican Party. Most of his positions were people liked him or respected him, so he got appointed to various positions. And no one really knew well what he stood for when he ran for president in '88. And of course, when he runs, he manufactures this whole persona that's just simply not him. I mean, George Bush, like Gerald Ford, is an incredibly decent man. And not only that, he was a genuine war hero. And so I think that wimp factor, they said the same thing about Jimmy Carter. There was a Boston Globe, you know, ran after the firings, after he fired some of his cabinet. I said the headline was "More Mush from the Wimp." So, you know, it's not.
Well, I would say that. We have fun with politics on the podcast because we're a happy podcast and we laugh and everything. I mean, Bush had two distinguished flying crosses. So he leads the country into war. And you mentioned about Eisenhower, how that credibility meant so much when he walked in the room or when he spoke to the American people. Do you think that someone other than George Bush at that time in 90 and 91 could have led the United States into the war against Iraq?
You know,
yes.
I mean,
do you think Dukakis could have, if he had won in '88?
He would have rode the tank. He would have put his helmet on and gone right into Iraq with that tank.
Read the Witkover German book on the 1988 election. It's classic. But I mean, clearly, I mean, you could have had Bob Dole. He ran for president in '88. Yeah. He received a Purple Heart. But I'm just saying that I think it's pretty clear both now and at the time that people were like, hey, this president's seen combat. He's volunteered for combat. He's been shot down. He's not just doing this sort of like willy-nilly to try to burnish his image, as you mentioned earlier.
Yeah. I think by 1988, the memory of World War II had faded. And I don't think people viewed him as Reagan's vice president. And I don't remember a lot of references to his World War II service. Of course, that film, they discovered the film of him being rescued.
Brilliant.
Yeah. But I think the thing about Bush, the influence of the war on Bush, is he had a very clear vision about what the United States had to do in dealing with Iraq, and he used language that touched a nerve. He used the Munich analogy. I mean, you read the letters that he wrote to his family, and over again, he's saying, you know, this is just like the 1930s. Think of all the Jews who would have been saved had we intervened in the 1930s, and I'm not going to make that mistake. So he had this very clear historical reference point that guided his approach, and he never wavered from that. And I think that, more than anything that people remember about his service in the war, that gave him the credibility to repel Saddam Hussein from Kuwait. The problem that Bush ran into is that, you know, having depicted Saddam Hussein as Hitler, he then allowed him to remain in power. And of course, but he knew why. I worked for a guy named David Bourne, who was a senator from Oklahoma.
Oh, yeah. College president.
He was my president at the University of Oklahoma for a long time. And he told me a story about how when we won the war and he got up on the Senate floor and he talked about how we had to go all the way to Baghdad and overthrow Saddam. He went back to his office and he had a phone call. It was from Bush. and he brings him over to the White House, and Bush has an easel with a map of the Middle East. And he went point by point exactly what would happen in the Middle East if we overthrew Saddam Hussein. It would completely change the balance of power and not to Americans' benefit. And Bourne said he slunk back to the Senate and never said another word about it. Of course, unfortunately, Bush's son finished the job, and we saw the consequences of that. But Bush was I think if I were to, my two favorite people who came out of this book are Kennedy and Bush. One Republican, one Democrat, because I think that they were more sophisticated in the way they viewed the world than were many of the others, and understood the weight of history, but also appreciated the challenges and what the opportunities were, and were not driven by ideology.
Let me ask, because this is what I thought of. Forgive me. I thought you were finished. Finish your point, please.
I did. I'm finished.
Is it difficult when you're looking at these 7 presidents, right? Is in some ways the biggest outlier isn't Reagan, it's Eisenhower. In the sense that, you're looking at JFK, lieutenant junior grade, LBJ, lieutenant. I mean, all these sort of junior officers. And then you've got the guy who commands the greatest amphibious invasion in the history of the world.
Yeah.
In some ways, is it hard to fit Eisenhower in this box just because he operated at such a completely different level during the war?
He certainly, during the war, he was the key figure in winning the war in Europe. And that certainly gives him that credibility to become president. I think, though, that once in office, he struggles with many of the same issues the other presidents did, and I think the one thing that emerged from Eisenhower's experience during the war was the limits of America to take the model that was formed in Western Europe during World War II and applying it to Asia. And I think that's a level of wisdom that the other presidents didn't have. Kennedy did to some extent, but he didn't have the same credibility as Eisenhower. I guess when I wrote this book, if there's one moment in time, an inflection point where I think a lot of things could have changed, would have been if Eisenhower walked out of that national security meeting and told the press exactly what he said behind closed doors. And he said, "This isn't a war for us. We can't win this war. We should not be involved in this war. We're not going to use atomic weapons, and we can't fight a second war in Asia in so many years." And if he had said that in 1954, I think he had the credibility to get away with it. But that was his biggest mistake in my mind.
It's a great point. You mentioned that you came out of the book with in your opinion, your opinions of George H.W. Bush and JFK heightened. Was there one whose opinions were your opinion of was lessened?
Johnson. If it could get any lower.
On that note, it's time for the 5 questions we ask all of our guests on the Leaders and Legends podcast for LBJ. You mentioned about Bush and World War II. Bush didn't wear his distinguished flying cross lapel pin, but yet Johnson wore the Silver Star everywhere he went. Tells you a little bit about those two men.
Not only that, he made sure, they didn't have any Silver Stars left. So he went to an Army Navy store and bought one. And then when he campaigned for Congress, he would have, if possible, an amputee come up on the stage and pin the Silver Star on him as if he was receiving it for the first time. And if you look at the pictures from Dallas, when JFK is assassinated, look at Johnson's lapel. He's still wearing it.
And Dole wore his Purple Heart lapel pin.
Yeah.
But
he earned it.
Robert Dole, his injuries in Italy were absolutely vicious and atrocious. It's actually cool that Bob Dole wore John McCain's POW bracelet, which McCain didn't know until he got to Congress.
I didn't know that.
Before I get to the 5 questions, I have something else I wanted to ask you, and I promise to make it quick. You talk about how your book's about how World War II shaped a generation of presidents, but that's not been our only war. How does the shaping of the presidency after World War II compare with the shaping of the presidency and the presidents after the American Civil War or the American Revolutionary War?
Well, in very, very different ways. The Civil War was a war against Americans. And we came out of that war, and we still are, I think, deeply divided over the legacy of the Civil War. We were decimated as a nation. We had a series of fairly weak presidents, in part because of the stalemate that emerged. The North won the war, but politically, the legacy of how we were going to deal with Reconstruction in the South was deeply divisive. What World War II is really unique in that it does two things. One is it unites the nation, creates clear lessons, but it also dramatically increases presidential power. The presidency in 1946 is completely different from the presidency that Franklin Roosevelt inherited in 1933. The size, the scope of the government, the amount of involvement it has in everyone's life, and also the powers of the presidency expanded dramatically in the years after the war. So I think they're very different legacies, the Civil War and World War II.
Not to mention, the existence of atomic weapons. You talk about worldwide power. It always seems that if I stood in front of a group of 100 people and gave a lecture on why World War II was a noble cause, nobody would blink an eye. But if I did the same thing and gave a speech about why Vietnam was a noble cause, it'd be a completely different reaction. And to me, the presidents who had to navigate the Vietnam War, I don't know if they were in no-win situations. But your point about President Eisenhower in 1954 saying we got the Marshall Plan going on, we got NATO going on, we've got unrest here in the United States, we've got all the things we want to do here. I hate to use the piss ant country term that Lyndon Johnson used, but that's one of the points I enjoyed most of your book, and I really enjoyed your chapter on George H.W. Bush at the end, on how he did what he thought was right when the easy thing in the world could have been to say, well, look, we got Saudi Arabia. If we lose Kuwait, then we lose Kuwait.
Yeah. And it was Margaret Thatcher who played a big role too in convincing Bush that, this could not stand. he was at the morning when he first, Brent Scowcroft wakes Bush up in the morning to tell him about the invasion. And he has a meeting with his cabinet. He's flying out to Colorado where he's scheduled to give a speech. And Thatcher is there. And in the morning, when the press asks Bush about what he plans to do, he's kind of equivocating. Partly because he doesn't have enough information. But after meeting with Thatcher, and Thatcher really came down hard on the need for the United States to push Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. And then you see Bush coming out with these strong statements that this will not stand.
We've reached the point on the Leaders and Legends podcast where we ask the same 5 questions of all of our guests. Professor Gillon, are you ready?
I'm ready to go, I think. Is there a buzzer I can press?
You want to phone a friend?
Yeah.
I promise these are easier than the questions you asked in your classroom.
Okay.
What was your first job?
My first job was working at a toilet paper factory, Scott Paper. I made a product called Cottonelle. You may be familiar with my work. I worked my way through college making toilet paper.
So that's as a unique an answer as we've ever had, I'll tell you that. The second question is, what was your first concert?
I've never been to a concert.
Ever? Rock, music, nothing?
Oh, wait. I went to the Rolling Stones when they came to Oklahoma in like 2005 or something like that. That was my first concert.
That's your first and only?
My first and only.
Well, I mean, I guess it's not going
I
to be
was in the
bad if it's
library.
number 3. If you could recommend any book for someone to read, which book would you choose?
Oh, that's tough. The book that had the biggest impact on me was Gordon Wood's Creation of the American Republic. That's why I became an historian. I read his book and I think this is what I want to do. Not as well as Gordon does it, but this is the type of thing I want to do for my life. And I went to Brown and to study with Gordon and then switched over to modern American history. But that's a thick book that's not easy reading for everyone. But it's the book that's had the most profound impact on me.
He's so incredibly brilliant.
He is. He is.
We've had several American Revolutionary War or colonial period historians on the podcast, and his name has come up more than once.
Yeah.
Question number 4. If you could witness any event in history, be there in person as it happens, which event would you choose?
Well, the Kennedy assassination. And I'd have binoculars.
And you'd want to be in the depository or on the grassy knoll?
I want to be on the grassy knoll with binoculars.
I don't know if well, no, because you and I haven't corresponded. We've just worked through your publicist, but Clint Hill has been a guest on my podcast.
I love Clint. Clint's been wonderful to me. When I wrote my book about John, I spent lots of time with him. I used to have a podcast that he was on. He was been a guest on my show on the History Channel. I love Clint Hill.
He was incredibly kind. I reached out to him blind.
Yeah.
And I said, I don't want to talk about any conspiracy. Actually, Gerald Posner has been on my book. Speaking of
close friends. We live in the same building in Miami.
Oh, you're kidding me. Gerald was wonderful. His wife is sweet as pie. They're just a great couple, but he came on the podcast. But when I asked Clint Hill, I said, I don't care about, the Oliver Stone movie or any of that nonsense or the gore. I just want to talk about the day. And he was a marvelous guest. So was Lisa. She was sitting right next to him.
Yeah. So the thing about Clinton, he's got that Secret Service mind where he just remembers things. And I've read his statement that he gave after the assassination, and it's almost identical to what he says now. Like he has all those details in his mind.
The quote that made the most impression on me is his answer to Robert F. Kennedy, what's going on or how bad is it? And Agent Hill responds, it's as bad as it can get.
So RFK Jr.?
To RFK. If I said Junior, forgive me, but RFK calls. He talks to Clint on the phone.
Right.
How bad is it? And Clint says,
I'm sorry, I misunderstood. Yeah.
It's as bad. I think I said RFK Jr. I apologize. It's as bad as it can get. And I can just only imagine Clint, Agent Hill squeezing out those words. It just had to be so tough. Last question. If you could have dinner with anyone living today, 2 hours off the record, just to chat, whom would you choose?
That's a tough one. So they have to be alive.
Making it person who is alive was my attempt to make the question easier, but it has
does
really
make it easier.
Worked.
But still, there's so many people I'd want to spend hours with. I find Clinton fascinating, Bill Clinton. And I've interviewed him before, but I could. 2 hours. If you have him for 2 hours, you get to ask 2 questions.
He is a huge history buff, as is George W. Bush.
Oh, really? I didn't know who W was.
Yeah, reads tons of biographies.
Oh, so I'll stick with. Actually, I'm writing this book now about the Clinton administration. I think the person I like to talk to is Al Gore, because he's talked to no one. He's like a mystery. Whereas Clinton's out there, I don't think I got 2 hours with Clinton. I don't think I'd learn anything I don't already know.
I'm trying to get James Carville on the podcast, so I'll let you know if I do.
Yeah. He's fun.
You have been listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast, presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise. As always, all our podcast guests, as always, all our podcasts are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Our guest today, author and historian Stephen Gillon. We discussed his book. It's a fabulous book, actually. I should be more clear. It's a terrific read. It made me laugh more than once or twice. And I hate to say that every once in a while, Mr. Gillon's or Professor Gillon's sense of humor comes through. The book is called Presidents at War: How World War II Shaped a Generation of Presidents from Eisenhower and JFK through Reagan and Bush. Thank you so much I kept you long. Apologies, but thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
This is wonderful. I really, really enjoyed our conversation, and thanks for the really thoughtful questions.
Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com.